that there are rooms where opening the door just once is enough for an unfinished prayer to be heard. 100 years later, do you believe that some confessions are not made for forgiveness, but simply to be heard to the very end? And do you dare to believe that there are places where the Holy Bible itself is so twisted that it bursts into flames in the hands of the one who brought it? Welcome back to Whisper Horror Channel, where whispers never fade into the night. Don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to join us again for more haunting stories every day. Today, we will step into Eastern State Penitentiary, a prison once called a stone chapel, but beneath that stone lies a curse not meant for demons, but for misguided faith. A young priest walked in, filled with arrogance, and only when he learned to listen instead of preach did the souls buried alive in silence finally agree to leave. This is a true story about a place the Bible could not reach. Some places on this earth are born from a flawed idea. They are cloaked in a noble purpose, but deep within, in every brick and every layer of mortar, a seed of decay lies hidden. The Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia is such a place. When it was built in the early 19th century, it wasn't called a prison. It was called a stone chapel, a revolutionary architectural feat designed to save the souls of sinners through absolute isolation. Its panopticon architecture, with cell blocks radiating from a central observation tower, was likened to the all-seeing, never-sleeping eye of God, an omnipotent presence that would shine into the darkest corners of the human soul and cleanse it with silence. But there are many kinds of silence. There is the silence of peace, and there is the silence of a tomb. The silence at Eastern State belonged to the latter. It was a heavy, dense silence. A silence that listened, that remembered, and that waited. The cold stone walls didn't just confine criminals. For nearly a century and a half, they absorbed everything. Every choked sob, every desperate curse, every unanswered prayer. They were all there, seeped deep into the very stone, becoming a part of the place itself. And then, the prison closed. But what was imprisoned within never truly left. It simply changed its name. From sinner, it became memory. From warden, it became obsession. The Diocese of Philadelphia knew this well. In the last 3 decades, since Eastern State became a historic site, they had received 3 calls, 3 desperate pleas for help from the management, the security guards, the night watchmen, people who had seen things that couldn't be explained, heard things that shouldn't exist. The 2 previous times, the church had sent seasoned priests, and both times, they returned with suspiciously identical reports: mass hysteria, psychological resonance due to the enclosed space, or perhaps toxic gas leaking from old pipes underground. Empty lies, because none of them dared to write down the truth. The truth about the shadows that glided at the edge of vision down long corridors. The truth about the hateful whispers in ancient Latin, emanating from empty walls. And above all, the truth about Cellblock 4C. A name, a number. But it was the epicenter of all the horror. The cell had been sealed with a rusty iron lock for over 50 years. After a guard hanged himself inside, leaving a single message written in his own blood on the wall: Non est hic Deus, God is not here. This time, the church decided to send someone different. Not a cautious investigator, nor a skeptical psychologist. They sent a warrior. Father Thomas Carraway was 28 years old, an age too young to bear the weight of faith. Yet Thomas wore it like armor. He was tall, with a slender but strong frame, and piercing blue eyes that held an almost fanatical fervor. To him, faith was not a silent prayer, it was a sword. Every verse was a strike. every drop of holy water a purifying flame. He had successfully performed several exorcisms in small parishes, facing weak entities, echoes of sorrow, and each success had bolstered his confidence. A confidence that was slowly turning into arrogance when Bishop O'Malley, an old man with eyes heavy with worry, assigned him the task at Eastern State. Thomas saw it not as a burden, but as an honor. They failed. Thomas thought to himself as he reread the old reports. Because they went in with fear. They forgot that no darkness is so dense that the light of God cannot penetrate it. The car took him to the prison on a bleak November afternoon. The Philadelphia sky was a leaden grey, and a cold, damp wind snaked through the trees, carrying the smell of decaying leaves and cold rain. As he got closer, the modern buildings grew scarcer, giving way to older structures. And then it appeared at the end of the road. Massive, silent, and menacing. Eastern State Penitentiary. It didn't look like a building. It looked like an ancient creature in a deep slumber. Its enormous stone walls, towering and stark, without a single window facing the outside, created a feeling of complete rejection from the world. The entire structure was like a fortress built not to keep enemies out, but to imprison something terrible within. Thomas stepped out of the car, and the cold wind immediately whipped his face, making his cassock flap. He looked up, and the first feeling that hit him was not fear, but a sense of challenge. He felt the place was watching him, judging him, and he met that invisible gaze with iron resolve. A middle-aged man in a security guard's uniform was waiting for him at the gate. It was Mr. Miller, the site manager. His face was deeply lined with fatigue and lack of sleep. His eyes had a vacant look, as if he had seen too much and now only wanted to forget. "Welcome, Father," he said, his voice hoarse. "Thank you for coming. Things have gotten worse." He said nothing more, just silently opened the heavy iron gate. The screech of rusting metal echoed in the stillness, sounding like a moan. When the gate slammed shut behind Thomas, all the sounds of the city seemed to be cut off. All that remained was the echo of their two sets of footsteps on the stone floor. An almost absolute silence. The silence here was not the absence of sound. It was a presence. Thomas could feel it. An invisible pressure on his eardrums. A tense anticipation in the air. They walked through long, dark corridors, flanked by the iron doors of the cells, all wide open like silent mouths. The dim light from the high windows was just enough to reveal thick layers of dust and peeling paint, exposing the bare brick and stone underneath. It was cold here. A cold that didn't come from the weather. It was a cold that seeped from the very stones. A cold of solitude and despair accumulated over centuries. Cellblock 4C. Mr. Miller finally spoke, his voice cracking. "It's at the end of this hall." The path to it seemed longer than the other corridors. The air grew thicker, and a strange smell began to creep into Thomas's senses. It was the smell of dust and mildew. But mixed in was something else. The smell of rust, almost like dried blood. And the smell of ash, as if a fire had been smoldering here for a very long time. Finally, they stopped before a door that was completely different from the others. It was made of thick oak, blackened with age, and reinforced with heavy iron bars. But what caught Thomas's attention the most was the lock. A huge brass padlock, tarnished green, with an ancient, intricate design. It didn't look like a lock meant to keep out ordinary people. Mr. Miller held out a single key, large and heavy, its surface worn smooth by time. "We never open it," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Not since the incident, but for the past few weeks. The night guards swear they hear scratching from inside. And sometimes, Singing. Thomas frowned. Singing a hymn? Mr. Miller swallowed hard. But the words. They're wrong. Thomas said nothing. Just stared at the door. He could feel it. A malevolent presence. Swirling and suffocating. Beating against the wooden door from the other side. Like a caged beast. But in his confidence, he didn't see it as a threat. He saw it as prey. And as the manager's trembling fingers inserted the ancient key into the lock, Father Thomas took a deep breath. And the air carried the scent of cold stone, of ashes, and of a curse that had waited far too long to be unleashed. The metallic sound of the ancient key turning in the brass lock was dry and sharp, each small click of the tumblers seeming deafening in the corridor's silence. Mr. Miller, the manager, had to use both hands to turn it, his knuckles white with effort. It was as if the lock was resisting not just with its physical mechanism, but with an unseen will. A resistance from the very wood and metal that had guarded this secret for so long. Finally, with a heavy, definitive thunk, the lock opened. Mr. Miller stepped back almost immediately, as if he had touched something scorching hot. He didn't dare look directly at the door, his eyes darting around the empty corridor, as if searching for an escape from his own workplace. He gave the door a tentative push with a trembling hand. It didn't open right away. The heavy oak door groaned. A long, mournful creak, like the sound of old bones breaking. It opened just a crack, enough for a draft of air to rush out from within. That air didn't have the usual musty smell of an abandoned place. It was a combination of scents that should not exist together. First came the cold. A deep, bone-chilling cold. Not like the weather outside, but the cold of an ice cellar. The cold of a place where light and warmth had never touched. Next came the smell of damp stone and old mortar. But it was overpowered by a pungent, metallic tang of rust. The cloying smell of blood long dried. And finally, hidden beneath it all, was a faint, acrid smell, like the ash of burnt paper, of fabric turned to charcoal, a scent of destruction. Father Thomas stood still, breathing it in. To Mr. Miller, it was the smell of horror, but to Thomas, in his confidence, it was the smell of the enemy. He recognized it. It was the scent of a demonic presence. A clear sign described in the texts. He tightened his grip on the silver crucifix in his hand, feeling the familiar coolness of the metal, and stepped past the stunned manager, pushing the door wide open himself. The door swung fully open, revealing the thick darkness inside. Cell 4C was not large, just a rectangular box of stone, perhaps a little wider than an arm span and about 3 paces long. The faint light from the corridor only illuminated the first third of the room. The rest was plunged into an almost tangible darkness. The first thing Thomas saw were the walls. They were built of large, rough-hewn stones, not carefully plastered. The surface was mottled with black patches of mildew and white streaks of mineral deposits. But it wasn't those things that caught his eye. It was the cracks. Countless hairline cracks ran vertically and horizontally across the walls, converging and branching out, forming a dense network like blood vessels. They didn't look like cracks from time or structural decay. They looked more deliberate, as if some force from within had been constantly pounding, clawing, trying desperately to escape for decades. And on the wall opposite the door, where the light barely reached, he saw it. The words Mr. Miller had mentioned. Non est hic Deus. It wasn't written in paint or charcoal. It was carved deep into the stone. The letters were a dark, brownish black and had a strange, faint sheen in the dim light. It didn't look like it was carved with a tool, but more like it had been scratched with fingernails. A frantic, desperate madness etched forever in stone. God is not here. A blasphemy. A declaration. A curse. Mr. Miller huddled behind Thomas, not daring to cross the threshold. "Do you see, Father?" he whispered, his voice cracking. It's always there. Sometimes I think it gets starker. As if the wound is still bleeding." Thomas didn't answer. He was focusing his senses. He could feel the pressure in the air, a heaviness pressing on his chest, making each breath slightly more difficult. But he wasn't afraid. He had been trained for this. He knew that fear was the door they used to enter. He clutched his crucifix, picturing it as a shield of light, and began to step into the darkness. The moment his foot was fully planted on the cold stone floor of the cell, a subtle change occurred. The whining of the wind outside seemed to die away. The only sound left was the pounding of his own heart in his chest. The door behind him, though no one touched it, slowly swung shut, leaving only a sliver of light as thin as a razor's edge. The room was plunged into near total darkness. "Lumen Christi," Thomas recited softly, the familiar prayer coming out as a reflex. He took out a box of matches and a small white candle from his pocket. He struck a match. The flame flared up, illuminating his focused face. But its light behaved strangely. Instead of spreading out, it seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. The flame was only strong enough to light a tiny circle around his hand, creating dancing, distorted shadows on the cracked walls. The shadows seemed to have a life of their own, stretching and shrinking, writhing like creatures in agony. Thomas lit the candle. The light became a little more stable, but still weak and fragile. He placed the candle on the floor in the middle of the room. He took out his prayer book and a small vial of holy water. This was his battlefield, and these were his weapons. He began the ritual. "Exorcisemus Dei, omnes immundus spiritus, omnis satanica potestas, omnis incursio infernalis adversarii." His voice rang out, strong and decisive in the cramped space. Every Latin word carried the weight of centuries of faith. He walked around the room, sprinkling holy water in every corner. The droplets glittered like diamonds in the candlelight before falling onto the stone floor. When the first drops of holy water touched the wall with the inscription, a sound was heard. It wasn't a loud noise. It was very small, very subtle. A faint hiss, like water being poured on a cold stone. Thomas stopped. He listened. Nothing. Perhaps it was his imagination. He continued the prayer, his voice louder, more resolute. He sprinkled the holy water a second time. This time, the hissing was clearer, and with it came a slight, almost imperceptible vibration, traveling up from the stone floor through the soles of his shoes. He stopped again, staring at the wall. In the flickering candlelight, he had the feeling that the cracks on the wall were faintly pulsing, as if the wall itself was breathing. His confidence began to waver slightly. A cold sense of unease started to creep into his mind, but he quickly pushed it away. "It's a sign," he told himself. "It's reacting. It's afraid." He raised his voice, reciting the most powerful verse about the Archangel Michael. "Princeps gloriosus in celestis militi, sancta Michael archangeli, defend nos in proelio." And that's when everything changed. The moment the name Michael was uttered, the candle on the floor sputtered and died. The room was plunged into absolute darkness. At the same time, the door slammed shut with a horrifying bang, cutting off the last sliver of light and trapping him inside. Thomas's heart stopped for a second. He stood motionless in the dark. The silence was now heavier than ever. He couldn't hear anything, not even his own heartbeat. It was as if he had been transported to another dimension, a place with no sound, no light, Only cold and darkness. Then he heard it, a scratching sound. It didn't come from any specific direction. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. From the left wall, the right wall, the ceiling, and from right under the stone floor where he was standing. The sound of 2 dozen sets of fingernails scratching frantically at stone. A sound that made his skin crawl. A symphony of desperation and madness. Thomas backed away, his back hitting the wooden door. His breathing became rapid. He tried to pray, but the words caught in his throat. Then the scratching stopped, as abruptly as it had begun, and a voice spoke in his mind. It wasn't a sound that traveled through the air. It formed directly in his thoughts. A dry, ancient, mocking whisper. "Little priest, you think you bring light to this place?" Thomas trembled. "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you, tell me your name," he shouted, trying to regain control. A faint chuckle, dry as autumn leaves, echoed in his mind. My name is pain. My name is forgotten. I am the echo of all who died within these walls, with curses on their lips and despair in their hearts. You cannot banish a memory, priest. You cannot exorcise a pain. You are a liar," Thomas yelled back, holding his crucifix high in the darkness like a useless weapon. "God is all-powerful. His word will cleanse this place." The voice chuckled again, this time with a hint of something like pity. "God, the God who watched his children be tortured in his name? The God who listened to their prayers and answered with silence? You're right. God is not here. He left a long time ago. It's just us." Suddenly, a blast of icy air swept across the back of Thomas's neck. He felt a presence right behind him, even though his back was pressed firmly against the door. A cold breath, carrying the smell of the grave and of ash, whispered in his ear. And then the voice was no longer in his head. It was whispering right next to his ear. A physical, tangible voice. "Now, let me show you what real faith looks like in this place." At the same moment, Thomas felt a searing pain in the hand holding the crucifix. He looked down in the darkness. His silver crucifix was glowing hot. Impossibly hot. It was no longer a symbol of protection. It was becoming an instrument of torture. His flesh began to sizzle, the smell of burning meat filling his nostrils. He screamed in agony and dropped the crucifix. It fell to the stone floor with a clatter, glowing a fiery red like an iron poker fresh from the forge. In that hellish light, Thomas saw the entire room clearly for the first time. The walls were no longer stone. They seemed to be weeping, streams of a black, tar-like substance oozing from 1,000 cracks, dripping down to the floor to form a viscous, black pool. And in that liquid, countless faces materialized and dissolved. Gaunt faces, twisted in pain, mouths open in a silent scream. The red light from the crucifix flickered one last time and died. Darkness returned, but that image was seared into Thomas's retinas. He stumbled back, tripped, and fell onto his back. His back landed on the cold, slick floor. He felt the black liquid seep through his cassock, cold and slimy against his skin. He lay there, in complete darkness, listening to the whispering laughter that surrounded him. His arrogance was shattered. His shield of faith was broken. His sword was shattered. For the first time in his clerical life, Father Thomas Carraway felt an emotion he had never truly experienced. Absolute terror. He realized his mistake. He was not a warrior coming to conquer. He was just a naive lamb who had walked straight into the wolf's den. And the wolf was hungry. Time in that darkness lost all meaning. It could have been seconds, it could have been an eternity. For Father Thomas, it was a slow death. He lay curled up on the cold, slimy stone floor, his entire body paralyzed with terror. The ghostly laughter had ceased, but its presence remained, wrapped around him like an invisible shroud, suffocating the air and freezing all coherent thought. He didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe too loudly. He just lay there, a priest without faith, a warrior without a weapon, awaiting the final blow. But the final blow never came. Instead, he heard a faint creak. The heavy oak door, which had slammed shut with inhuman force, was now slowly creaking open. A grey sliver of late afternoon light pierced the room, cutting through the darkness like a knife. The light was weak and bleak, but to Thomas, it was as brilliant as the sun. The encompassing silence broke. The scratching disappeared. The cold breath on his neck vanished. The black liquid on the floor seemed to stop bubbling. It was as if the play had ended, and the lead actor was allowed to leave the stage. Thomas's body moved before his mind could command it. A primal survival instinct kicked in, stronger than fear. He scrambled up, his limbs trembling so violently he couldn't stand. He crawled. He slithered through the filthy puddle, heading towards the sliver of light like a drowning man reaching for the surface. His whole body was filthy, his black cassock now soaked and reeking of mud and decay. He burst out of cell 4C, collapsing onto the corridor floor. He gasped for the outside air, and though it was still cold and stagnant, it was the air of the real world, not the air of a tomb. He propped himself up, his back against the opposite wall, his eyes not daring to look back at the door from which he had just escaped. Mr. Miller, the manager, was still standing at the end of the hall, his face as white as a sheet. He had heard the door slam. He had heard Thomas's muffled scream, but he had not dared to approach. Now, seeing Thomas emerge in such a pathetic state, he cautiously drew near, his eyes filled with pity and a deep-seated fear. "Father, are you all right?" he stammered, not daring to touch him. Thomas looked up. His hair was matted, his face smeared with dirt and a greasy black liquid. His eyes were vacant, staring into nothingness. He looked down at his right hand. The burn was red, blistered, and excruciatingly painful. His silver crucifix was still lying in the darkness of the cell. He had left it behind. He had abandoned his weapon on the battlefield. "It was nothing," Thomas said, his voice a hoarse, unrecognizable rasp. He tried to stand, but his legs were still shaking. Just lack of oxygen in there. It caused hallucinations. It was a lie. A weak, pathetic lie. But it was all he could cling to at that moment. His intellect and pride were desperately searching for a rational explanation, a life raft to pull him from the abyss of the irrational. He couldn't admit defeat. He couldn't admit that there were things beyond comprehension, beyond the control of the faith he had always worshipped. Mr. Miller said nothing. He just looked at Thomas's burned hand, then at his disheveled state, and in his eyes, Thomas read the answer. He didn't believe him. He knew. He had seen similar things before. I'll take you back," Mr. Miller said, changing the subject. The drive back to the city was a journey in silence. Thomas sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window but seeing nothing. The buildings, the traffic, the bustling people, they all seemed to belong to another world. He felt an invisible pane of glass separating him from them. He had gone to a place they would never know, and he had brought a piece of it back with him. He glanced at his right hand, temporarily wrapped in Mr. Miller's handkerchief. The throbbing pain from the burn was a constant, tangible reminder of what had happened. Hallucinations don't cause second-degree burns. A small, rational voice whispered in his head. He immediately silenced it. Thomas's apartment was on the third floor of an old brick building. A small, neat space that, until today, had been his absolute sanctuary. He thanked Mr. Miller mechanically and hurried inside, slamming the door shut as if to block out the entire world. He stood in the middle of the living room, listening to the silence. But this silence was different. It no longer brought peace. It was filled with anticipation. The first thing he did was go to the bathroom. He had to wash. He stripped off the soaked cassock, tossing it into a corner like a horrifying memory, and stepped into the shower. He turned the water on, so hot it was almost scalding, hoping the physical pain could overwhelm the pain of the burn on his hand and the coldness invading his soul. Water streamed over him, but he didn't feel any cleaner. The black liquid from the cell seemed to have seeped into his skin. He scrubbed, rubbing his body with soap until his skin was red, but he still felt enveloped in an invisible, slimy, cold film. He looked down at the water swirling at his feet. It was a murky grey. He told himself it was just dirt. But for a moment, he thought he saw long, black strands of hair floating in the water before disappearing down the drain. He stepped out of the shower, a towel wrapped around his waist. He looked into the steam-fogged mirror. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken. He carefully unwrapped the handkerchief from his right hand. The burn looked worse. The skin was blistered and raw, and in the very center, where he had held the crucifix, the shape of a cross seemed to have been branded into his flesh, a mark of his failure. He shuddered, quickly applying ointment and clumsily bandaging it. He needed to pray. He needed to reconnect with the power he had always trusted. He put on clean clothes, then knelt beside his bed, clasping his hands. "Our Father, who art in heaven," he began, but the prayer sounded foreign, empty in his own mouth. The familiar words no longer brought comfort. They were just meaningless sounds. He tried to picture the face of God, of the Virgin Mary, but all that came to mind was the thick darkness of self or sea, the twisted faces in the black pool, and the whispering laughter echoing in his head. The connection was severed. The phone line to heaven seemed to have been unplugged. For the first time, he felt utterly alone in the universe. Panic began to rise. He shot to his feet, pacing the apartment. He had to get out. The air in the apartment was becoming suffocating. He had to be outside, among other people, to prove to himself that the world was still normal, that he was still a part of it. He threw on a coat and rushed out of the building. Evening had fallen, and the street lights were beginning to glow. He walked aimlessly, merging into the downtown Philadelphia crowd leaving work. The sound of car horns, laughter, music from shops. The sounds of life enveloped him but couldn't penetrate the cocoon of fear and isolation. He walked past parks, squares, strange faces drifting by like ghosts. He stopped at Rittenhouse Square. Couples holding hands, people walking their dogs, students sitting on the grass reading. A scene of absurd peace. Thomas found an empty bench under an old oak tree and sat down, feeling exhausted to his bones. He just wanted to sit there, to let the normality of the world seep into him, to drive out the coldness from within. He sat there for how long? He didn't know. He just stared blankly at a fountain in the middle of the park, his mind empty. And then, he felt someone watching him. It wasn't a normal feeling. It was a weighted attention. He slowly turned his head. At the other end of the bench, a man was sitting. Thomas hadn't heard him approach. He was simply there, as if he had been there for a very long time. The man was in his late 50s, but looked much older. He wore a frayed old coat, faded jeans, and a pair of worn-out boots. His salt and pepper hair was unkempt, and his scraggly beard was untrimmed. But it wasn't his disheveled appearance that caught Thomas's attention. It was his face. It was a map of pain. A long, white scar ran from his left temple down to the corner of his mouth, making one side of his face look like it was perpetually fixed in a faint, grim smile. Another scar, like an old burn, mottled his neck, visible just above his collar, and his eyes. His eyes were brown, but a faded, tired brown, as if they had seen too many things in this world that no one should ever see. Those eyes weren't looking at Thomas. They were looking at a point in the air, right next to his head. They sat in silence like that for a few minutes. Thomas felt uneasy. He was about to get up and leave, but something about the man's stillness kept him there. Then the man spoke. His voice was deep, hoarse, and as tired as his eyes. "You didn't come out alone, Father." Thomas froze. His entire body went rigid. What did he say? How did he know he was a priest? He wasn't wearing his cassock, and he knew he had just come out of somewhere. Thomas turned completely, looking straight at the man. "What did you say?" The man didn't look at him. His gaze remained fixed on the air beside Thomas. He tilted his head slightly. "It's looking through your right eye." A chill ran down Thomas's spine. The stranger's words, the calm way he said them, as if commenting on the weather, were more terrifying than any scream. "Who are you?" Thomas asked, his voice beginning to tremble. The man finally turned to look at him. For the first time, their eyes met directly, and for a moment, Thomas felt as if this man wasn't just looking into his eyes. He was looking straight into his soul, seeing the cracks, seeing the fear, seeing the dark shadow clinging to him. "My name is Gabriel," he said. Then he raised a calloused finger and pointed to the long scar on his cheek. "It always leaves a mark, one way or another. Sometimes on the outside." He paused, and his gaze bored into Thomas's. "Sometimes on the inside." With that, Gabriel slowly stood up. He didn't say another word. He just gave Thomas a slight nod. A nod that wasn't a greeting, but more like an acknowledgement, a condolence. Then he turned and shuffled away, disappearing into the crowd behind a tree. Thomas sat frozen on the bench. His heart pounded in his chest. Gabriel, the name of an archangel. But that man didn't look like an angel. He looked like someone who had walked through hell and back. His words echoed in his head. "It's looking through your right eye." Thomas shot up, practically running from the park. He had to get home. He had to look in the mirror. He had to prove that the man was just a lunatic. A bizarre, random coincidence. By the time he got back to his apartment, it was completely dark. He didn't turn on the lights. He went straight to the bathroom in the dark, his trembling hand fumbling for the switch. The cold fluorescent light flickered on, making him squint. He stared at his reflection in the mirror, a pale, terrified face. He leaned in close, straining to see his right eye. Nothing. It was still his eye. Blue iris, black pupil. Nothing unusual. He let out a sigh of relief, a trembling relief. He was crazy. Gabriel was just a homeless madman. Everything will be fine. It's stress, lack of sleep, hallucinations from the toxic air in the cell. He repeated these explanations in his head like a mantra. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He sat in the living room with all the lights on, trying to read to distract himself. But he couldn't concentrate. Every little noise in the building, the groaning of the pipes, the creaking of the floorboards upstairs, made him jump. He felt like he wasn't alone. The feeling of being watched that he'd had in the park had followed him home. Around 2 in the morning, he heard it, a faint scratch. It came from the wall behind him. The sound of fingernails on dry wall. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Thomas froze. His heart seized. Impossible. This is my apartment. The 3rd floor. There can't be anyone there. He tried to convince himself it was just a mouse. Or the neighbors. But that scratching sound. It was too similar to what he had heard in Cell 4C. He slowly stood up. Turning to face the wall. He pressed his ear against it. The scratching had stopped. And then, right before his eyes, something horrifying happened. The olive wood crucifix his mother had given him, the one hanging proudly on the wall, suddenly began to vibrate violently. It shook for a few seconds, then was ripped from its nail, as if an invisible hand had torn it down. It didn't fall straight to the floor. It flew in an arc across the room and slammed against the opposite wall, shattering into pieces. Thomas's jaw dropped, watching in horror as the wooden fragments scattered across the floor. This wasn't a hallucination. This was real. The proof of its presence. A desecration of his most sacred symbol lay at his feet. Panic finally broke through all his rational defenses. He stumbled back, tripped over a table, and fell to the floor. He looked around the room with wild eyes, and then, his right hand, the burned and bandaged hand, began to twitch. It convulsed uncontrollably, fingers clenching and unclenching. Thomas tried to hold it still with his left hand, but it was useless. His right hand seemed to have a will of its own, a strange force controlling it. His arm was lifted stiffly, like a puppet on a string. It moved jerkily, bringing his hand towards the nearby coffee table. On the table was a ballpoint pen and a notepad. His hand, in a spastic motion, grabbed the pen. He cried out, trying to resist, but his body no longer obeyed his commands. His arm was pulled towards the white wall opposite, where the crucifix had just been destroyed. He felt the tip of the pen press against the cold surface of the wall, and then, it began to write, stiff, scrawling movements. His hand was forced to move, writing words he did not want to write. He watched the blue characters appear on the wall, and the horror inside him rose to a crescendo. It was Psalm 23, his favorite psalm, the psalm of comfort and hope. But it was being perverted. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want for pain. He maketh me to lie down in green graves. Yea, though I walk through the valley of eternal shadow, I will fear evil, for thou art there to torment me. Every word was a blasphemy. Every sentence was a knife twisting in his shattered faith. He cried. He screamed in helplessness. But his hand did not stop. It wrote until the entire distorted psalm was inscribed on the wall of his once sacred space. When the last word was written, the force controlling his hand suddenly vanished. The pen dropped to the floor. His arm fell limply to his side. Thomas sat on the floor, panting, tears and sweat streaming down his face. He stared at the writing on the wall. The proof of the violation, the possession, his utter failure. He slowly raised his head, his empty gaze drifting towards the large mirror at the end of the hall. He didn't want to look. He was terrified of what he would see. But he couldn't not look. He dragged himself towards the mirror, like a condemned man walking to the gallows. He stood before it, looking at the reflection of a broken man. And then, he looked into his right eye. For an instant, just a brief instant, his reflection vanished. In its place was something else. Reflected in his right eye was the image of another face. A gaunt, twisted face, with a mouth open in a silent scream and eyes white with pure hatred. Thomas let out one final scream. A scream of horror and acceptance. He stumbled back, his back hitting the wall, and slid to the floor. Gabriel was right. It hadn't just followed him. It was inside him. The rest of the night was a series of fractured moments of sanity for Father Thomas. A constant struggle in the hell of his own mind. He didn't dare sleep. But he wasn't fully awake either. He sat huddled in a corner of the living room, his back against the wall, eyes fixed on the blasphemous writing on the opposite wall. The entire apartment, once his private sanctuary, had now become a prison cell. Every shadow grew longer, more distorted. Every noise from outside, a distant ambulance siren, the rain beginning to fall heavily against the window, sounded like a harbinger of some impending horror. He had tried to pray one more time. He mumbled the prayers he had known by heart since he was an altar boy. But they were just hollow sounds. The line connecting him to God, a line he once thought was an unbreakable steel cable, was now severed. He felt like he was screaming into an endless void, receiving only the echo of his own despair. The entity from Self-4C hadn't just defeated him. It had conquered God's territory in his soul, planting its flag of doubt and fear. It had shown him a terrible truth, that in some places, faith wasn't a shield, but a target. The worst nightmare came just before dawn. Exhausted and terrified, Thomas slumped to the floor and fell into a fitful, haunted sleep. In his dream, he was standing in a field of ash under a blood-red sky. Surrounding him were thousands, tens of thousands of people, all dressed in the black and white striped prison uniforms of the 19th century. They stood silently, heads bowed, their bodies as transparent as smoke. Then, in unison, they all looked up, and Thomas saw they had no faces, just a smooth, blank surface. Then they all raised a single finger, pointing at him, and from where their mouths should have been, a single sound arose, a unified whisper, growing louder and louder, like the sound of a giant swarm of locusts. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Thomas jolted awake, drenched in cold sweat, the whispers from the dream still echoing in his ears. He knew he couldn't stay here another second. He also knew he couldn't go to the bishop. What would he say? That he had failed? That he was possessed? That he, a warrior of God, had thrown down his weapon and fled the battlefield? The shame and wounded pride were more painful than the burn on his hand. There was only one option left. A crazy, irrational option. But the only one. Gabriel, the man with the scarred face and the eyes that had seen hell. The sun began to rise, painting the sleepy city in a dreary grey. Thomas threw on his clothes, not daring to look at the room again. He bolted from his apartment, down the stairs, and out into the cold, drizzling rain. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to find that man. But how do you find a nameless, homeless man in a city of millions? He started where he had met him, Rittenhouse Square. The park was deserted in the early morning, save for a few joggers and sanitation workers. The bench where they had sat was empty. Thomas paced around the park like a caged animal, his desperate eyes scanning every stranger's face. He asked a janitor, describing Gabriel. The worker just shook his head, saying there were hundreds of men like that in this city. Desperate, Thomas began to wonder. He went into smelly alleys, run-down neighborhoods, places where the light of the skyscrapers couldn't reach. He looked into every weary face, every tired figure huddled in a doorway. He felt like he was stepping into another Philadelphia, a world that existed parallel to the glamorous one he had known. This was the world of the forgotten, of those left behind by life and, perhaps, by God. And for the first time, he felt a strange empathy for them. After hours of fruitless searching, as the rain began to fall harder and Thomas was on the verge of giving up, he saw him. Gabriel was standing under the awning of a closed pawn shop, quietly watching the rain. He showed no surprise at seeing Thomas. soaked to the bone and out of breath. Approach him. His eyes were still calm, still tired, as if he knew Thomas would find him sooner or later. Please, Thomas gasped, his voice hoarse and trembling. He no longer cared about the dignity of a priest. He was just a drowning man, grasping at the last life raft. Help me. You were right. Everything you said was right. It's inside me. Gabriel looked at him for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over the gaunt face, the panicked gaze, and the clumsily bandaged right hand. Then he gave a slight nod. Follow me, he said, and started walking into the rain. Thomas asked no questions, just silently followed. They walked through unfamiliar streets, deeper and deeper into an old industrial district. Finally, Gabriel stopped in front of an abandoned warehouse with a rusted iron door. He pulled out a ring of old keys, unlocked a side door, and motioned for Thomas to enter. Inside was not a warehouse, but a makeshift living space. The only light came from a few bare bulbs hanging from the high ceiling. The vast space was divided by tarps and old pieces of plywood. In one corner, there was a simple cot, a wooden table, a chair, and a few cardboard boxes used as cabinets. The air smelled of dust, machine oil, and loneliness. This was Gabriel's home, a sanctuary built from the world's refuse. Gabriel motioned for Thomas to sit in the only chair. While he sat on the edge of the cot, he looked at Thomas, who was shivering from cold and fear, and spoke in his deep, hoarse voice. Tell me, he said. Tell me everything. And Thomas did. He told him everything. About his confidence when he took the assignment. About what he had seen and felt in cell 4C. About the crucifix melting in his hand. The laughter in his mind. Their meeting in the park. And finally, the nightmare in his own apartment last night. He told his story in stutters. The words jumbled, but he hid nothing. He laid bare all his failure, his fear, and his collapse for this stranger. When Thomas finished, he buried his head in his hands, his body shaking with choked sobs. He had unburdened himself, but the emptiness that remained was even more terrifying. Gabriel listened in silence, without interruption, without judgment. When Thomas had quieted down, he finally spoke. You made the same mistake many men in your cloth have made, Father, Gabriel said. You went in with a sword, when what they needed was an ear. They? Thomas looked up, confused. You mean that demon? Gabriel shook his head slowly. There is no demon. Not in the way your church teaches. What you faced was not a single entity from hell. It's something far more complex. It's a collective resentment. A pain that has festered for decades, congealed, and gained a consciousness of its own. He paused, staring into space, as if looking back at his own memories. Think about that place, Eastern State. It was built on the idea that isolation leads to repentance. But for most, isolation only leads to madness. Imagine you're a prisoner there, in the 19th century, locked up 23 hours a day in a stone cell, forbidden to speak to anyone, tortured with cruel therapies like the tranquilizing chair or the ice bath, all done in the name of saving your soul. The wardens, the chaplains, they didn't see themselves as evil. They believed they were doing God's work. They used God's name to justify their cruelty. Those prisoners, Gabriel continued, his voice dropping, they died in there, from disease, from suicide, from despair. And when they died, they didn't die with prayers on their lips. They died with rage. They didn't hate God. How can you hate something you've never truly felt? No. They hated God's representatives. They hated the symbols of the faith that was used to torture them. The crucifix, the Latin prayers, the black cassocks. Thomas was speechless. Gabriel's explanation, though horrifying, had an undeniable logic. It explained why his crucifix had turned against him. It explained why his prayers were twisted. It explained why it hated him so much. It's not a demon, Gabriel repeated. It's a wound. A massive spiritual wound that has been left to fester for over a century. And when you went in there with your crucifix and your prayers, you weren't a doctor coming to heal. You were like someone rubbing salt and alcohol into an open wound. You only made it hurt more. And it reacted. But why did it follow me? Thomas asked, his voice trembling. Why is it inside me? Because you are like them, Gabriel said. And his eyes locked onto Thomas's. A look devoid of pity but full of understanding. The priests before you. They came with fear. They felt the pain and they ran. But you came with arrogance. You believed your faith was an all-powerful weapon. You believed you had the right to judge and to cleanse. That arrogance, to this wound, is just another form of cruelty. It is the echo of the wardens, of the chaplains of old. You opened a door in your own soul, and it walked right in. Thomas slumped. Everything had crumbled. His entire worldview, his entire belief system, was crushed to pieces. He wasn't a warrior of God. He was just an arrogant fool who had provoked a pain he couldn't comprehend. So, what do I do? He whispered. A desperate plea. How do I get it out? Gabriel sighed. A heavy, weary breath. He rolled up the sleeve of his coat. In the dim yellow light, Thomas saw for the first time what was hidden underneath. Gabriel's arm was covered in scars. Scars of all shapes and sizes. Long, straight cuts. Round, ragged burns. Marks that looked like they were from an animal's claws. Some were rolled, white against his weathered skin. And some were newer, still pink. It was a road map of pain. This is my way, Gabriel said. His voice almost a whisper. When I face a pain that cannot be healed, I take it upon myself. I open my heart. Accept it. Feel it as if it were my own. I relive their deaths, their despair, their rage. I let it burn me from the inside out. And when it has unloaded all its burden onto me, it finds peace. And it leaves me a souvenir. He gently touched a scar on the back of his hand. Thomas looked at the scars with a mixture of horror and awe. He began to understand. Gabriel wasn't a demon hunter. He was a sin eater. He used his own body and soul as a vessel for the pain of others. I can't do that, Thomas stammered. I know, Gabriel said. And you don't have to. This wound, it doesn't need a substitute. It needs something else. Something only you can give it. What is it? An apology. Gabriel replied. A sincere apology. Not from a soldier coming to conquer. Not from a judge coming to pass sentence. But from a brother. A priest. A representative of the very faith that hurt them. Coming before them with humility. Admitting the mistake. And asking for forgiveness. Gabriel stood up. Walked to one of the cardboard boxes. And took something out. It was a wooden crucifix. Very simple. Crudely carved from two branches tied together with a leather cord. It looked powerless. He handed it to Thomas. Your faith is not a sword, Gabriel said. Repeating the words Thomas had once thought in his arrogance. But with a completely different meaning. It's a bridge. Go back there. Don't fight it. Talk to it. Listen to it. Show it that true faith isn't cruelty and judgment, but empathy and compassion. Use your faith to heal their faith. Thomas took the wooden crucifix. It was warm and light in his hand. A stark contrast to the cold, heavy silver crucifix he had lost. He looked up at Gabriel. And for the first time, he no longer saw a weary homeless man. He saw a living martyr. A man who had turned his own pain into a path of salvation for others. In Gabriel's tired eyes, Thomas saw not pity, but trust. "I'll go with you," Gabriel said. "I'll be there. But this is a fight you must face alone. This is a debt of faith. And you are the one who must pay it." Thomas gripped the wooden crucifix. His trembling had stopped. The fear was still there. A cold knot in his stomach. But it was now enveloped by something else. A new purpose. A resolve born from the ashes of his downfall. He knew he had to go back to Eastern State. Back to Cell 4C. But this time, he wouldn't go as a warrior. He would go as a penitent. The journey back to Eastern State Penitentiary was a reverse pilgrimage. The first time, Father Thomas had arrived with the confidence of a conqueror. The car, a chariot, and his prayer book, a map to glory. This time, he sat silently in Gabriel's old pickup truck, feeling like a death row inmate voluntarily returning to his own execution. The drizzle had turned into a downpour, the raindrops drumming against the windshield like thousands of tapping fingers. A dreary rhythm for this unwanted return. Gabriel sat behind the wheel, silent. He offered no advice, no comfort, not a single word. His silence wasn't indifference. It was a solid presence, a rock in the storm raging in Thomas's soul. Gabriel's silence said, "I am here. I will not abandon you. But this is a path you must walk alone." Thomas didn't look outside. He just kept his head down, his hands clutching the simple wooden crucifix Gabriel had given him. The rough, warm wood in his palms was a stark contrast to the cold, smooth silver of the one he had lost. This was not a symbol of power. It was a reminder of humility. He wasn't mumbling any prayers. He was listening. Listening to the silence within himself, to the chaotic beating of his heart, and trying to find, in the ashes of his faith, a small spark of courage. When they arrived, the prison loomed through the rain like a giant sea monster emerging from the abyss. Its stone walls were dark with rainwater, looking as if they were bleeding. Mr. Miller, the manager, was standing under the office awning, smoking a cigarette, when he saw Gabriel's truck pull up, and especially when he saw Thomas get out. His expression shifted from surprise to disbelief, and finally to undisguised fear. "Father, what are you doing back?" he stammered, quickly extinguishing his cigarette. "There's nothing left to do here. Just leave it be." This time, Gabriel got out of the truck. He stood beside Thomas, a silent, grim figure. He didn't look at Mr. Miller, but his presence seemed to frighten the manager more than any ghost in the prison. "The father has unfinished business," Gabriel said, his voice low and steady, overpowering the sound of the rain. "Open the gate for us." It wasn't a request. It was an undeniable command. Mr. Miller, though trembling, silently retrieved his keys and led them inside. The screech of the iron gate echoed once more, and once more. The outside world was left behind. But this time, Thomas perceived the place differently. The cold was still there, the gloom still pervasive, but he no longer felt hostility. Instead, he felt a vast sadness, a pain that had settled over centuries, as thick as the dust on the floor. The long corridors no longer seemed like the throat of a monster. They looked like scars on a body that had endured too much. As they neared the corridor leading to Cellblock 4C, Gabriel stopped. He placed a calloused hand on Thomas's shoulder. "I will wait here," he said. "This is your bridge. Cross it." Thomas nodded, speechless. He took a deep breath and walked alone toward the end of the hall, toward the dark oak door. Every step was heavy, as if he were walking against a current. He could feel it, That entity, sensing his return, a cold wave of resentment and mockery washed over him. But this time, he didn't try to fend it off with prayers. He simply endured it, let it pass through him, and kept walking. He stood before the door of Cellblock. The last time, he had come as a judge. This time, he came as the accused. No key was needed. He just placed his hand on the door, and it slowly swung open with a mournful creak, as if welcoming him back to its hell. The darkness within was thick and inviting. Thomas crossed the threshold. The door slammed shut behind him. But this time, he didn't flinch. He wasn't scared. He accepted it. He had voluntarily entered this tomb. He stood in the absolute darkness. In the heavy silence, the smell of dried blood and ash filled his nostrils again. The cold began to seep into his bones again. He could feel hundreds of unseen eyes fixed on him from all directions. Waiting. They were waiting to see what he would do. Would he draw his weapon again? Recite those empty prayers? But Thomas did nothing. He didn't try to light a candle. Didn't reach for a prayer book. He just stood there, in the stillness, his arms at his sides, his right hand still clutching the wooden crucifix. Then he knelt. That simple act seemed to stun the entire room. He knelt on the cold, filthy stone floor, bowing his head in a posture of complete surrender. And he began to speak. His voice was not loud, not powerful. It was just a whisper, trembling but sincere. A human voice in an inhuman space. I am here, he began, not as a priest, not as a soldier of God. I am here, as Thomas, and I have come to say I am sorry. The moment the words I'm sorry were spoken, the room reacted violently. A knife-sharp, freezing wind swept through, carrying the screams of 1,000 voices merged into one, echoing directly in his mind. The scratching on the stone began again, more frantic and furious than ever. The walls seemed to be closing in, trying to crush him. It was enraged. It didn't believe him. An apology was an insult to its pain. But Thomas didn't stop. He closed his eyes, endured the spiritual tempest raging around and within him, and continued to speak. I am sorry, he repeated, his voice a little louder, trying to rise above the roar. I am sorry for my arrogance. I am sorry for coming here with a sword in my hand, not realizing that you were the ones who had been stabbed. I thought I was bringing light, but I only brought more shadows of judgment. The room's fury intensified. Thomas felt as if icy hands were grabbing him, clawing at him. Horrifying images flooded his mind again. Even clearer this time. He saw a young inmate chained to a wall, starved to death, while a chaplain stood outside praying for his sinful soul. He saw a woman submerged in a tub of ice water, screaming until she had no breath left. A therapy called curing hysteria. He felt their pain, their helplessness, and above all, their betrayal. Betrayal by the very people acting in God's name. Tears began to stream down Thomas's cheeks. But these were not tears of fear. They were tears of empathy. He was crying for them. I am sorry, he sobbed, his voice breaking. I am sorry on behalf of those who wore the same cloth as I, who used the symbols I revere, to cause you unspeakable pain. They took the name of God and turned it into a curse. They took the cross and turned it into an instrument of torture. They were wrong, utterly wrong. And in the name of a faith that was tarnished, I kneel here before you, and I ask for your forgiveness. He bowed his head even lower, his forehead almost touching the filthy floor. And then, a change occurred. The screaming didn't stop, but its tone began to shift. The rage and fury gradually gave way to an endless sorrow, a wail that had been suppressed for over a century. The frantic scratching on the stone became sobs. Mournful cries. The room was no longer trying to crush him. It was weeping. Thomas felt the change. He looked up. He knew what he had to do next. He held up the wooden crucifix. Not as a weapon, but as an offering. True faith is not like that, he said. His voice now calm and steady. A steadiness born from being broken. True faith does not judge. It listens. It does not punish. It heals. It is not a cold stone wall. It is a warm embrace. That is the faith I bring to you today. Not to banish you, but to stay with you in this darkness, until you are ready to see the light. He began to pray. Not the powerful Latin rites of exorcism. He recited the Lord's Prayer, the simplest, most humble prayer. He said it in English, slowly, clearly, letting each word soak into these suffering walls. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. As he prayed, a miracle happened. From the wooden crucifix in his hand, a gentle light began to emanate. It wasn't the brilliant white light of angelic power. It was a warm, soft golden light, like candlelight, that spread throughout the room. The light did not banish the darkness. It blended with it. It did not burn the suffering souls. It embraced them. The mournful wailing in the room slowly subsided, turning into a sigh of relief. The pressure in the air dissipated. The bone-chilling cold was replaced by a gentle warmth. The foul smell of decay gave way to the faint scent of wet earth and wildflowers after a rain. When Thomas reached the final words, "But deliver us from evil. Amen," the room fell completely silent. But this was a completely different silence. A silence of peace, of release. The cell door slowly swung open. The light of a fresh morning, after the rain, flooded in. Thomas remained kneeling on the floor, exhausted but serene. He looked around. The room was now just a room. The old stone walls, the cracks were still there, but they no longer looked like bleeding wounds. They were just the marks of time. The inscription on the wall seemed to have faded, no longer menacing. The wound was healed. The debt was paid. He slowly stood up, stepped out of the cell, and took a deep breath of fresh air. Gabriel was standing there, at the end of the corridor, waiting silently. He wasn't smiling, but in his tired eyes, for the first time, Thomas saw a glimmer of light, a quiet satisfaction. Gabriel walked over and simply placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. A gentle pat, but it contained all his understanding and respect. They walked out of the prison together. The sun was up, its first rays piercing through the dissipating clouds. The sky was clear and clean. To Thomas, the world seemed to have been reborn. And so had he. As they stood before the main gate, Thomas turned to the man who had saved him in more ways than one. "Thank you, Gabriel," he said. A simple but heartfelt thanks from the bottom of his soul. Gabriel just nodded slightly. "Where will you go now?" Thomas asked. Gabriel looked out at the waking city. "Debts are everywhere," he said. A simple answer to a complex life. Then he turned and shuffled away, his old frayed coat flapping gently in the wind. He didn't look back. He simply walked on, a solitary figure, melting into the crowd, disappearing into the heart of the city, to continue his unending journey of bearing debts. Thomas watched until Gabriel's figure was out of sight. He looked down at the wooden crucifix in his hand, then up at the clear blue sky. He had entered a place the Bible could not reach, and there he had found a faith more powerful and true than anything he had ever known. A faith built not of stone and power, but of empathy and compassion. He was still a priest, still a soldier of God. But now he understood that sometimes, the greatest battle is not against the darkness, but in learning how to listen to it, and that is how. A cell, sealed for over a century, was finally heard, not with holy water, not with swords, but with an apology and a prayer that had once been left unfinished. When Father Thomas left Eastern State Penitentiary, he was no longer a warrior carrying doctrine, but a man carrying something more important than salvation, empathy. And as the morning light shone through the old stone corridors, his shadow fell longer and lighter, because for the first time in a century, Cellblock 4C was truly silent, not the silence of fear, but the silence of a curse that had been lifted. Thank you for listening to the very end. If tonight's story has touched some part of the faith within you, leave a comment, share your thoughts, or simply type one word, Amen. Don't forget to subscribe to Whisper Horror channel so you don't miss other whispers from places where even the Bible dares not tread. Until we meet again on a night when no one is left to answer your prayers.